In 1918, the First World War ended in disaster for Germany. The German army lost the war, its people suffered from starvation, and the country was on the brink of civil war. After a series of rebellions within the German military, Emperor Wilhelm II abdicated and fled the country. After that, Germany experienced years of chaos, poverty, and famine. Out of those ruins emerged Adolf Hitler, a leader who promised to resurrect Germany's glory and transform it from a ruined country into a great power. In a short time, Germany grew rapidly and became one of the strongest countries in the world. However, in just 6 years, Hitler showed another side of himself. He began to invade cities in Europe one by one, until he finally became the most powerful leader in the world at that time. This begs a question: how could Hitler transform Germany from a poor and divided country into a powerful industrial country capable of fighting on various fronts? I'm Muhammad Izdian Muttaqin, and today we are going to answer that question and discuss the story of the rise of one of the most famous figures on the stage of history, Adolf Hitler. Now let's start our story. The story begins in 1914, the year when the First World War broke out. Normally, when we hear the word war, we will feel fear and anxiety. However, this was not the case in Germany at that time. On the contrary, the German people welcomed the news that their country was engaged in the war with enthusiasm and joy. This photo you see is one of the proofs of that celebration of the German people when they heard the news that their country was joining the war. If you look closely, there is someone in the photo that we probably already know: Adolf Hitler. This was the first photograph ever taken of Hitler in Germany. After that, he would appear in thousands of other photographs and become one of the most famous figures in history. However, at the time this photo was taken, Hitler was nobody. He was just a 25-year-old man who had only been living in Germany for a few months. Previously, he worked as a painter in Austria and lived in a modest condition in a small room in the city of Munich. He joined the German army in search of a better life, leaving behind his difficult past in Austria. Austria is the place where Hitler was born in 1889. He spent his childhood. If we look at old photographs of Hitler, we can see some interesting things. In many photos, he often stands alone in the sidelines. Many people interpreted this as a sign that Hitler had a childhood full of loneliness. He lived in difficult conditions and received harsh treatment from his father, while his mother, Clara, loved him very much. Hitler's relationship with his family is not very clear, but to be sure, it did not last long. By the time Hitler was 18, both of his parents had died. Although their loss must have been hard for him, it seems that Hitler felt free. He left school and pursued his dream of becoming an artist. Hitler believed that he was a talented artist, so he enrolled at the Academy of Art in Vienna. However, he was rejected. Not giving up, he collected money, made better paintings, and then tried again. Unfortunately, he was rejected again. At this point, Hitler's dream of becoming an artist was shattered. Not only that, but his finances were also exhausted because he had spent all of his money on painting. As a result, he had time to live in the homeless shelters. Even more painful for him, his paintings were sold cheaply to Jewish merchants, who then resold them at high prices and made a profit, while Hitler himself struggled to get money to eat. Feeling that he no longer had a future in Austria, in 1913 Hitler moved to the city of Munich, Germany. It should be understood that the area where he lived in Austria was not too far from the German border. So for Hitler, his move was not like a migration between countries, but only a move between regions. Moreover, the inhabitants of Austria and Germany have many cultural and ethnic similarities. At that time, Germany was a more developed country than Austria. Germany experienced an industrial revolution and had many artists, scientists, and intellectuals. Hitler felt that in Germany he could have a better chance of life. However, his plans changed drastically just 1 year after his move. In 1914, the First World War broke out. Germany and Austria joined the war. Hitler, who was still in his midst of 20s at the time, volunteered to join the German army. If we look at the photographs of Hitler during the war, it's clear that his personality changed. He became more confident. Not only can it be seen from his photograph, but also from the fact that he was awarded 2 medals of bravery during his service. The war lasted for 4 years, and eventually Germany was defeated and surrendered to France and Britain. This defeat shocked the German people, including Hitler. He did not understand how his country could lose. Even though in the battlefield the German troops seemed to still be able to fight. At that time, the German emperor tried to calm the people by saying that this was not a defeat, but only a truce or ceasefire. However, the reality is much different. Germany was forced to surrender in very humiliating conditions. The German emperor also met his country entangled in a treaty that gave Germany severe punishment. This sparked a major rebellion within the German military. Many members of the navy revolted, which eventually forced the emperor to abdicate and flee Germany. Thus, the German Empire officially collapsed. After the fall of the German Empire, a new government known as the Weimar Republic was formed. However, the early days of the Weimar Republic were full of chaos, politically, militarily, and economically. At the time, hyperinflation hit Germany. The value of their currency fell drastically. $1 is equivalent to 1 billion German marks. Not a million, not 1,000, but 1 billion marks. This situation caused many people to starve. In fact, only the super rich can still afford a loaf of bread. In the midst of these conditions, the victorious countries, especially Britain and France, continued to pressure Germany with demands for war reparations. They treated Germany like a country that should be punished for the defeat of the First World War. This made the German people even more depressed, and it was in the midst of this chaos that Adolf Hitler began to emerge as a political leader who promised to change Germany. Since Germany did not have enough money to pay for war reparations, France and Britain, especially France, took action on their own. They said, If you cannot pay, then we will take it directly from your resources. Eventually, France sent its troops to Germany and took over the industrial area as well as the coal mines. This was not just an economic punishment, but also a form of humiliation for Germany. In the midst of this chaos, many small political parties began to emerge in Germany. The main goal of these parties is to drastically change the condition of the country. One of them was the German National Socialist Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party. Initially, the Nazi Party was just one of hundreds of small parties that stood in Germany in the early 1920s. One of their early photos shows the symbol of the swastika, crooked cross, that would later become the main icon of the party. In the photograph, there are people from a variety of backgrounds, some rich, some poor, but most are former German soldiers who have experienced defeat, betrayal, and humiliation. Although the Nazi Party became known to the public, one thing remained a mystery: who was their leader? At that time, not many people knew who the leader of this party really was. He goes by the pseudonym Wolf. A German satirical magazine even tried to predict the fate of the Nazi Party leader by making various illustrations. Some of them described it in a mocking way. There are also those who say that the leader of this party is a weak and insecure person, so he is afraid to show his face. At this point, the leader of the Nazi Party finally decided to appear in public and reveal his identity. That guy was Adolf Hitler. Hitler became the leader of the party shortly after joining because he was interested in the party's ideology, and the party was also impressed by his oratory skills. At that time, Hitler began to spread his own photographs, some of which showed him with a friendly and democratic expression, others of the authority of a strong leader. These photos were posted everywhere as a marketing strategy to increase his popularity and bring him to the highest level of power. From his various life experiences, Hitler developed a unique political style. He did not hesitate to blame the Jews for the economic crisis in Germany, as many of them controlled the banking sector in Europe. He also attacked the communists, who had just taken over Russia. To some, Hitler's speech sounded racist and hateful. However, for the desperate and suffering German people, his words gave new hope. In a short time, thousands of people began standing for hours just to listen to his speech. In each of his speeches, Hitler promised to eradicate poverty, restore Germany's glory, and make the country a world power. These promises sound impossible. How can a country that is being hit by hunger become the most powerful country in the world? But surprisingly, Hitler really believed in his own words. His conviction grew stronger after seeing what was happening in Italy. At that time, a very strong nationalist movement was developing in Italy. The Fascist Party, led by Benito Mussolini, managed to take power in 1922 through massive mass action. Seeing Mussolini's success, Hitler became increasingly convinced that he could do the same in Germany. The Italian government was eventually forced to retreat. Seeing the success, Hitler said, "This is an idea that I will imitate." He plans to carry out a similar action in Germany by holding a march from Munich to Berlin. However, his plan failed miserably. Unlike Italy, where hundreds of thousands of people took part, there were only dozens of people in Hitler's march. As a result, Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison on charges of treason. However, there are things to understand. Although Hitler was imprisoned, the Nazi Party remains active. Secondly, Nazi propaganda was very sophisticated in shaping Hitler's image. They smuggled cameras into the prison and took photos of Hitler behind bars. This photo was later disseminated, depicting Hitler as a hero who was fighting to save Germany but was instead imprisoned by the tyrannical government. As a result of this propaganda, many people began to see Hitler as a persecuted victim, not only as a criminal. In fact, however, Hitler enjoyed his best time in prison. There, he read dozens of books that dramatically changed his way of thinking. In fact, he wrote one of the most famous books in history, Mein Kampf, or in English, My Struggle. While Hitler was still in prison, the German elections of 1924 were held, and at that time his party, the Nazis, got 3% of the vote. Despite being sentenced to 5 years, Hitler served only 9 months in prison before being released. Upon exiting, his strategy has changed completely. From acts of violence, he switched to a more subtle approach. The new principle is pretend to be weak enough to be strong enough to control everything. Now Hitler began to present himself as a more democratic person. He said to the world, "Okay, I may differ in some views, but I accept everyone." This approach turned out to be very successful in shaping his image. However, Hitler's success was not just the result of his own efforts. He was supported by several important figures in Nazi Party, including Heinrich Himmler, who would later lead the German secret police, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's right-hand man, Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief and one of the most influential figures in the party. However, even though the Nazi Party was growing in popularity, they still couldn't gain power. In the next election in 1928, the Nazi Party's vote share actually dropped to 2.6%. In the middle of 1920s, the economic situation in Germany began to improve slowly. Germany is still poor and suffering, but the government is seen trying to improve the situation. The German people did not want major changes because they feared that the new government would take them back to the famine. However, things changed drastically in 1929. In that year, the United States stock market experienced a major crash, or Great Depression, causing economic crisis around the world. The United States is on the verge of bankruptcy. The people sleep on the streets and have difficulty getting food. Therefore, the US government demanded their money back from UK and France. However, Britain and France are also experiencing financial difficulties. They said to the Americans, "We don't have any money now, but we have money we can collect from Germany." Germany, already defaulted and saddled with huge debt, is now under pressure to pay even more to war winners. With no other choice, the German government printed large sums of money to pay off debts. As a result, the German economy is further destroyed. Inflation is soaring, and the people are falling back into poverty and hunger. Of course, you don't need to be an economist to know that printing large amounts of money will lead to inflation and ultimately destroy the economy. and that's what happened in Germany. As a result, Germany fell back into an economic crisis that was worse than before. Under this condition, the Nazi Party rose again and became even stronger. In the 1930 German election, the Nazi Party's vote increased dramatically to 18.3%, and at its peak in July 1932, they became the majority party with 37.3% of the vote. Hitler's popularity increased many times until finally, in early 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. This means that Hitler is now the number 2 man in Germany. However, in 1934, the President of Germany, Hindenburg, died. Seeing this golden opportunity, Hitler immediately appointed himself as Germany's supreme leader. After Hitler came to the power, Germany was no longer referred as the Weimar Republic, but became Nazi Germany. Shortly after, a major event occurred, the fire of Reichstag, or Germany Parliament building. This event shocked many people. The Nazis alleged that the perpetrator was a communist supported by the Soviet Union. They then used this incident as an excuse to dissolve the German Communist Party, which was one of their biggest competitors. This was Hitler's first strategy to take full control of Germany. However, there are many theories that claim that it was the Nazis themselves who burned down the Reichstag building. They did this only to create panic and gain the sympathy of the people. Whatever happened, these fires became the most successful propaganda tool for the Nazis. However, this is not their last propaganda. Meaningfully, Nazi stands for National Socialist, which comes from the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or NSDAP, or the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Despite having an element of socialist in the name, Nazi ideology leaned more towards extreme nationalism, fascism, and racial supremacy. They rejected communism and democracy and emphasized authoritarian leadership and total loyalty to the state and Hitler as Führer or leader. Hitler wanted to show the world that Germany was a democratic and peace-loving country. For this reason, he hosted the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. At the opening ceremony, more than 100,000 people shouted Hitler's name. With this, Hitler used sports as a propaganda tool to strengthen his image and that of the Nazi Party. However, sport is not the only way he takes advantage of it. Hitler also took advantage of the world of cinema. At that time, films had a huge influence on society. Therefore, the Nazi Party began to produce large-scale propaganda films with passionate titles, such as Triumph of the Will, Victory of Faith. These films worshipped Hitler and Nazi Party. In addition, some Nazi films began to spread hatred against Jews. However, we will go to that part later. Another modern method that Hitler used to spread his influence was radio. By 1930s, radios was already in almost every home in Europe. In fact, radio is also used in schools. With radio, Hitler's voice could be heard everywhere, at any time. All this propaganda was the work of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Minister of Propaganda. Goebbels was very good at his job. It was he who made Hitler the most popular leader in history. Images of Hitler are everywhere, Hitler's voice was heard in every house, and the German economy recovered and grew rapidly. Germany became a strong industrial country. Major companies such as Volkswagen, Mercedes, and Adidas were thriving. The German military was expanding at a terrible pace. At this point, Hitler felt that Germany was no longer just an ordinary country. Germany is now an empire. Hitler also began to plan expansion. His main goal was to unite all Germans in Europe under his rule. And of course, he also wanted revenge against all those who had humiliated Germany in the past. Thank you for watching this video until the end, and we will continue this story in the next video, inshallah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.